Thanks very much, and it's brilliant to be back in front of a housing audience. I don't think I've talked to people from housing for a good 3 years, so thank you, Alistair, for the opportunity, and thanks to Julia for a really inspiring presentation. PACT is important, and it's driving a lot of thinking right across the community and voluntary sector. Is my clicker clicking? Downwards.
If you let that chat the expert, I would love to. There we go.
We're here. Okay. So I'm going to apologise in advance because I'm going to chuck loads and loads of statistics at you. Are there statistics fans out there? One. All right. I'm sorry, guys. I can. But I am going to talk a lot about community centres. Are there community centre fans out there? Yeah. All right. Okay. So I'm from an organisation called Local Trust. I'm going to talk a little bit about what Local Trust does in a minute, but in broad terms, we run something called the Big Local Programme, which some of you may have come across in your areas. It's a lottery programme that's been running since about 2012, and it's a programme which focuses on putting £1 million into each of 150 communities around the country in the hands of local residents, and it allows them to make the decisions about where it's spent. It's a quite radical programme. It's a programme that we've been kind of learning as we go along. In some areas it's had problems, in some areas it's been brilliant and successful, and I'll share some of those with you. I think what's been at the heart of the programme, though, from the start, is actually the very principles that Julia set out in her presentation around PACT. It's very much about putting decision-making, putting trust directly in the hands of local people and believing that they're best placed to make the best decisions that need to be made. So how did we end up publishing a report a couple of months ago about left behindness? And I know this is a kind of contested phrase and some people won't like it. We can talk about that later. The reason we did is because a lot of the areas that we work in, a lot of the big local areas, were chosen because they were places where, back in 2012, there hadn't been many lottery grants historically. And actually, there hadn't often been that much in the way of regeneration funding. And what was the idea at the time was that these places hadn't got their fair share of funding, because actually there wasn't enough civic organisation in those places. There weren't the residents groups, there weren't the community organisations to make the applications for funding. So the thought was that by putting £1 million in, you could start to make a difference, to start to build the civic capacity that could make a difference. So these places were places which the lottery felt had been left behind by the lottery back in 2010, 2012. And the left behind phrase has been coming into fashion again recently. I apologise for putting two such familiar faces. I think I was trying to work out who has the lowest net popularity or the highest net unpopularity. But on both sides of the political divide, we're seeing leaders starting to talk about issues of left behindness, that some communities have been forgotten, have not had their fair share from the economy, from politics. They feel that they've become disconnected from other places, and that frankly it isn't fair and something needs to be done. But there's been issues around actually how we describe that, and that was what we wanted to explore. We wanted to explore actually when politicians glibly talk about communities being left behind, what are these communities and where are these communities, and what are the things that lie at the heart of the challenges that they're facing? Because it's been on the news, you know, apparently we have left behind towns. This was a map that was done which showed the areas of the country where people weren't earning a living wage. And you can see certainly that there are some parts of the country that seem to be doing quite well in terms of wage levels, and some parts of the country, the ones in dark red, that are doing really poorly. This was an attempt by a geographer called Danny Dorling to describe the division in the country, and he drew that line based on the density of red brick terraced housing. And he said everything on the red half of the line had effectively missed out on a lot of the proceeds of growth in the economy over the last 20 to 30 years. I found this one slightly more helpful. I don't know if anybody wants to express an opinion. I grew up in Leeds, and I think I had dinner. But anyway, we'll move on. Going back to the Big Local Programme, the Big Local Programme is an interesting programme. It's a programme where we put that £1 million into each of 150 areas. We said to people who came together, who stood up and said they wanted to make a difference, you've got 10 to 15 years to spend that money. There were areas like the Firs and Bromsgrove, Bromford Estates in Birmingham, the estate on the edge, this estate is Kirkhallam on the edge of Rochdale, the Arches Estate, the Luton Estates in the centre of Chatham, East Sheppey, Chell Heath, north of Stoke, the centre of Jarrow. And often these are places which used to have a buzzing economy, trade unions, a whole load of civic life, but a lot of it's been swept away. In some places, all you've got left are the rather kind of nice artistic embodiments of what used to be there, probably paid by a regeneration programme or two ago. So this is a bit of a ship in Jarrow, probably the only one you'll see. But what's special about Big Local was the fact that we didn't set down rules. We said, all you need to do is come up with a plan for the area, consult with local people. This is in Kidderminster. Meet as a group and decide what you want to do. Come up with a plan and then start building things. So this is in Thurcroft, between Rotherham and Doncaster. They decided that they wanted to build themselves a new community centre. Goldthorpe, not far away, Dearne Valley, there was a row of houses which had real issues with abandonment, rat infestation. They bought them and they put them back into use. St Matthew's in Leicester, they built new sporting facilities. And you've got gardening, you've got rather odd gardening. You've got litter pickups, you've got street signage, giant allotment sheds, and all sorts of events happening. But something that struck us, and has struck us over the first 7 years of the programme, is that in those communities where the starting point is that the pubs have shut, and we all know places like that, and where the community centres have closed down or are on limited hours, maybe where the shops have gone away, that actually these places found it much harder to get up and running. You'd think going into a community and you're saying to the residents, here's £1 million, you can make a difference, that actually people would jump at that and would start to really roll with some amazing ideas to achieve change. And we've seen that in some places. We've seen giant solar farms, we've seen the new community centres, we've seen enterprise work. But in the places where everything had already closed down, it seemed to be different. It could take 6, 7 years to give people the confidence to start to organise and make decisions and make a difference. So we wanted to know what was going on there. And we employed some guys called OCSI. They're the consultants who work with the government to create the Index of Multiple Deprivation, which is how government judges where money needs to be spent. And we asked them if they could start to create an index that could sit alongside the IMD, which looked at those social factors, particularly looking at social infrastructure. So are there places to meet? Are there pubs? Are there social clubs? Are there community centres? Because, community centres are great, but actually, there are other places where people get together. How connected are those communities? Are there bus services running in? Where are the services? Where are the schools? How easy is it to get to the supermarket? And how engaged are those communities? So actually, are there organisations in those communities that can bring people together? So it's all right having a community centre, but if you haven't got groups which can actually make things happen there's not much use to it. It doesn't end up running. And what's great now with data is that you can crunch all of that. So we mapped every single community space in the country, every single community centre, every school, every pub, every nightclub, every park. We dropped pins in them. We created density plots. We looked at how close people were to work, how close they were to services, what broadband speeds were like, whether people had cars. We looked at voter turnout. We looked at SME lending. We looked at the grant funding going in from funders into areas. We also looked at some of the government survey material around strength of local relationships and participation in sport and leisure activities, because they're important ways of bringing people together. And we ended up with an indicator. We called it the Community Needs Score. I'm not sure it's a great name, but it was kind of start with, which enabled us to map the entire country on the basis of whether there were the effective building, what we thought might be the effective building blocks of good community culture, places to meet, organisations to bring people together, and also connectedness to the outside world, so you can bring people in, you can bring ideas in, you can make stuff happen. This is a national map, but I just wanted to quickly, I've just switched it off, okay. Just to quickly show you, this is not the same as deprivation. This is a map which scatters every place in the country. And it shows you there's a bit of a correlation, but there's a lot of noise. But what I was particularly interested in is the places down in the bottom there. These are the places that are both really deprived on the index of multiple deprivation, where people are really properly, measurably poor, but also they don't have all the rest of that stuff. They don't have the pubs, they don't have the community centres, they don't have the organisations to bring them together. Because it seems to me that if you've got money, you can buy yourself out of that, can't you? You can get on the train, you can get in your car, you can go and connect to other things, you can go to the theatre in town. But if you haven't, and you're lodged in a place, then the facilities in that place make a big difference. And these were the places we found. In the northeast, we found that the places that were both had the worst, the 10% poorest, but also where it overlapped with the 10% worse in terms of community infrastructure, were the areas around the edge of Bishop Auckland, the former mining villages, up on the edge of the northeast coast. In the northwest, we found it was the estates on the edge of. So the estate on the edge of Widnes, the estates on the edge of Warrington, on the edge of Wigan, on the edge of Oldham, on the edge of Rochdale. We all know what they're like, the places that are on the edge, often of second-tier towns that are struggling themselves. And these seem to be the places where you've both got really significant levels of poverty, but also where a whole lot of soft and hard community infrastructure, the buildings and the organisations, seem to have been stripped out. In Yorkshire, it's largely around the South Yorkshire pit villages. In the East Midlands, not so much in the East Midlands, a few estates on the edges of places like Kettering, Wellingborough, Northampton. In the West Midlands, it's the big estates on the edge of Birmingham, and it's the estates on the edge of Stoke, so places like Feghays, Chell Heath, places, you know, sitting between, you know, Bromsgrove and Birmingham, which appear to be connected to neither, but where there's also a real lack of community facilities. And then you've got what became known as the Brexit coast. And I'll show you why this is important slightly later on in the presentation. Interestingly, in London particularly, there are very few places which are both very poor and also don't have these facilities, because frankly, London, there are shops, there are places to go, there are places of worship that people come together. It doesn't matter how poor you are, you can get on a fairly cheap bus and get somewhere where there's stuff to do and places where you can be connected quite easily, but that's not the case elsewhere in the country. And that's quite important in a politics that's often viewed through the lens of London rather than through the lens of other places. So I wanted to quickly show you why this is important, because we went looking for places, remember, that were poor and also lacked this social infrastructure. It lacked the community centres, it lacked the pubs, it lacked the community organisations. And we found that when you map those places, they're really different from poor places overall. So this is a chart which shows, middle line is the average population growth for England. Top line is the average population growth for the worst places, the most deprived places in Britain on the index of multiple deprivation. The big line at the bottom is for these places that are both poor and lack community infrastructure. And you see these are places that are shrinking compared to the rest of the country. They're places where you've got people living there who've got much, much worse jobs where they've got jobs. In fact, if you look at these communities which we went looking for because of their social facilities, ended up finding them on the edge of some of our poorer northern towns, Midlands towns in particular, you find that unemployment in those places before 2008 was marginally better than unemployment in inner city London or inner city Manchester on average. But since 2008, something happened in the financial crash that made it suddenly get much worse, and it's accelerating away. There are 4 times fewer jobs per unemployed person in these communities. You've got many much higher levels of people who are on benefits because they've got life-limiting illnesses, because they're carers. Much higher levels of illness. You've got 60% higher lung cancer rates in these communities and higher rates of blood pressure, obesity, depression. And that's both compared to national figures and compared to the worst places on the government's index of multiple deprivation. You've got more kids in lone parent households. Child poverty is getting, the improvements in child poverty getting slower. And I guess this is what I found quite interesting about these places is traditionally when we think about poverty in Britain, often we see it through the lens of the inner cities. We kind of look, particularly if you're based in London, you look at places in inner London where people are very poor, and you think that there's a lot of issues there relating to community cohesion, relating to to race discrimination. There's a lot of issues around exclusion and new migrant communities, and all that stuff is absolutely true. But in these communities that I identified, the poorest places in Britain that also have the least in the way of social facilities, the people who live there are 90% white. That compares to about 65% white on average in the worst 10% of the IMD. So there's some very particular types of communities around the country that are suffering very badly and it appears to be associated quite strongly, their social outcomes, with a lack of places to meet and a lack of civic organisation. That's associated with a whole range of adverse social outcomes that I think all of us agree are things we don't want to see. And if you have a list of where they are, these are all the communities that, interestingly, are the battleground places in the election, because actually this stuff is important. If you start to allow communities to become disconnected and you take away the stuff that binds them, that brings them together, you end up creating communities that don't feel, if they don't feel connected themselves, they also don't feel connected to the rest of the country. So this is, if people tell you that Brexit is about the economy, don't believe it, because this is the correlation between Brexit vote by local authority area and in how poor the area is. And you'll see that it's almost a flat line, it's nothing there. If you take poverty out of it entirely and you map the Brexit vote to, do you have community centres and pubs? Do you have a good number of civic organisations, people applying for grants, people getting stuff done, and are you connected to other places? You find there's a straight line correlation. It's such a strong correlation that Andy Haldane, the chief economist of the Bank of England, gave over 5 pages of a speech in Newcastle a couple of months ago to this chart. And his point was that something has happened in this country which has meant that we've lost track of what's going on in the periphery. Housing providers live with that. You know, a lot of the social housing estates on the edge of our northern towns, our Midlands towns, are those places, the places I've been talking about. And at the heart of what's happened is a withdrawal of what some people call, might call a social contract. It's not the usual social contract, but it's the one where no matter how, and I was talking to a quite elderly retiring Labour MP for somewhere in Manchester, Tony Lloyd, a few days ago, and he was saying when he grew up on the edge of Manchester in a desperately poor estate, there were still pubs there, so his dad could go and meet his mates and feel connected. There was a community centre where he spent his life, where that was where he made his friends, that was where he felt safe. There were shops just down the road, so his mum could go down the shops and she'd meet her friends and she'd be connected to the shopkeeper. There was a whole load of stuff that meant the community felt that it was connected. There were jobs that weren't that far away. But what we've seen over the last 20 to 30 years, for a whole host of reasons, is all of that stuff disappear. The community centres have been closed down. I was on 5 estates in Birmingham recently, which had 7 community centres 10 years ago, and it has none now. To such an extent, the church has handed over its vicarage and said, listen, guys, just meet up here because this is outrageous. So you've got the community centres have gone, the shops have moved away, the communities have started to become disconnected. And that seems to be associated with a whole load of outcomes that go well beyond simple poverty. It's about a whole load of social connections starting to dissipate. And whether that's, throwing out a vote of anger in Brexit, or sitting at home depressed and, or possibly dying because you're not looking after yourself, that's come together. And I think if I kind of finish now, hopefully I've kind of set an uplifting mood for any questions. But it seems to me that if you're serious as, for landlords here, if you're serious about doing good in your community and making a difference, then a starting point isn't just investing in the quality of homes, but it's going back to actually to some of the stuff that Julia's former employer, JRF, were talking about in the early 90s, looking at investing in communities, making sure there are community centres where people meet, not imposing ridiculous business requirements, which mean they have to hire it out to Zumba and yoga and all the rest of the stuff every day of the week to stay in business, but allowing it to be a place where people meet, thinking about how you plan places where there are shops where people can come together, and looking at what you can do to support communities to build their own self-organised structures, whether it's knit and natter groups, or it's reading groups, or it's effective residents committees. Frankly, it doesn't matter. What's important is creating the soft structures that bring people together and bind them. Because when we lose that, we start to lose community. I've got some other great pictures for you, but I'll probably stop here. Thanks very much.
Well done, Matt. Excellent.
So, that was an outspoken attack on Zumba, so that wins my vote. Any questions or thoughts for Matt? Oh, it's this gentleman again. Hold on a second.
I'm chatty today.
It's all right, man. You're giving our team a bit of exercise. That's good stuff. They've all got their Fitbits. They're loving it.
Hi there. I'm Steve again from Hackney. Just a couple of points. You talked about connectiveness, you know, in terms of the research that you commissioned, connectiveness and people in areas which you identify on the indices are being very poor and in poverty, and also the lack of contact because of transport and all that. I just want to challenge the generalisation which I often hear about London. I agree, you know, I agree with lots of points you make about London, but I think your input on London is a bit simplistic. Parts of London don't have some of they do have a lot of, you know, the transport is good. You know, the cheapest fare is 150, compatible with Manchester, which is 150. I just Googled that while you were talking, yeah. And, yeah. So, but the point I'm saying is for young people in London, certainly the borough I live in, lots of borough, territorialised by gangs, by crime gangs based on drugs, the county lines, we all, you know, watch that on TV. But in the borough I live, there's always been an ongoing problem ever since I've lived there for 28 years now of a gang culture. Now that's even more so with the drug. The other factor which impact on, so for these young people, they can't just hop on the bus and go, they just can't walk across the next estate because they've been in another gang's territory and they're in danger. They may get stabbed or, you know, shot. If you're not part of a gang, you still have the same thing. Young people on this estate I live on, which are not part of any gang, have to plan their journeys to get to college to make sure they don't go through territory, yeah? Now, that needs to be reflected in the generalisation, you know, that you made. The other thing is I come from Norfolk, I've lived in London now for 30-odd years, but I lived in the village. You know, if you didn't have a car or a bike or a horse to get to the nearest town, which was 5 miles, you had to walk. You had to walk because there was no buses. So I do fully understand the lack of contact, you know, having contact and public transport. But please, I challenge the concept of London that you make. The other impact, and I get your points. I think they're really important. I think there is a difference between London and elsewhere in terms of the nature of the challenges being faced. So I totally accept London. I helped set up a youth football team in North London. You know, one of our kids' brother was stabbed. We have to get him training every day, and part of how we spend our money because he didn't go out because the guys have got his brother and trying to get him. You know, a lot of the kids to get to training have to plan their route to training for exactly the reasons. I don't dismiss any of that. And that's particularly an issue for young people in London. The challenge, the difference between London and some of our peripheral estates is around the difference between the personal and the structural. So in London, there are real issues for people within certain areas which will come from kind of gangs, or possibly from mental health issues, possibly from issues around education, all which are very important to deal with in order to get people connected with the rest of the community. And I don't diminish difficult issues in some cases. In other parts
parts of the country, peripheral estate, it doesn't matter whether you've got gangs, whether you're well, you've got your qualifications, out of a whole bunch of people who all work to get level qualifications in administration, but they can't get jobs, and there's nowhere where they can use those skills. So what you've got there is profound structural issues that are different. There's a lack. They need places to meet. They need stuff to bring them together. In London, if you can get some of the personal issues, you can access work. You can access places to go, places of worship. There are groups who have problems, but it's not everybody who has problems. And I think there are very different kind of factors and circumstances.
Just to take that debate on. When you've got all these either or who's the greatest priority discussions, you inevitably walk into difficulties, don't you? And this, of course, is why Jeremy Corbyn has come back with the 1970s idea of universal services, hasn't it? So the broadband will be the same everywhere, the dental care will be the same everywhere. It's a determination to tackle the split, the divisions. So it's very much, you're bringing people, Julie's people, and you're very good point. It's nuanced, it's different wherever you choose to go. So maybe one more question from someone else, then we'll break for a break. This chap here. Again, if you say who you are and where you're from, I'll appreciate it. Yeah.
Thank you. My name's Stuart. I'm from London Borough Redbridge. So a very clear message I heard was about physical connection, a place, an activity, a group, etc. I think my daughter must be about the most connected I know. She's got about 4,500 friends, apparently. So my question, a couple of questions. One is, does digital have any place in this? In terms of providing, I guess we all have a basic human need to belong somewhere or to something or to someone. But does digital help plug any of that anywhere? And the second question is, as a housing organisation, what can we realistically do as part of this? Some kind of practical suggestions.
Okay, first of all, I'm sure digital works for some people, but actually face-to-face human engagement is important. You need to come together. When you go out to the poorest communities, most heartbreaking is the extent to which people having tried for years and their confidence is broken, and they just retreat into their homes and don't come out. And they may friendships on the internet, it doesn't actually substitute for having a fulfilling life that's full of connection and purpose. So I think
I'm sure your daughter's fine. Don't worry about it.
Secondly, as a housing provider, I think there are some takeaways from this. Frankly, if there are not places to meet in the communities that you are building, then you need to think about how you design those. If there are community centres in your area which are getting run down, they may not even be yours. How can you support them, and how can you support organisations to grow them? Critically not. I think to make them sustainable, it's not about funding people from the outside to come in and deliver services. We've had enough of those, and they come and they go. How do you actually work and nurture the confidence, capacity, and skills of local people so they can run for themselves? Because that seems to be the stuff that works best and makes a difference. If you go back over the last 40 years of regeneration programs, we recently commissioned some completely different presentation on that. You find that the regeneration programs seem to have the biggest impact on normal people, ordinary people, as opposed to shopping centre owners and the like. Those programs where at the outset they put residents in charge and gave them control over decisions, as opposed to just having one or two people on as a bit of decoration whilst local authority officers kind of pushed it all through, and the developers and the consultants cut deals together. So something about thinking very honestly about how you implement some of the stuff Julia talked about in her presentation, and how you do your business is really important.
Great stuff. So should we thank Matt once more?